that like priority, like numero uno? Like,
No.
is that the top? What is the biggest issue for you, do you think, like that we probably have to deal with at the minute?
Okay, so
Go for it, man.
That's all right. Yeah. I've never touched on it. I don't write about climate change. It's not something I really write on. I wrote a lot about fracking several years ago. Climate change isn't something I've really touched on. I personally believe that while it's the biggest issue we face as a planet and as a ecosystem and as a species, those with the power will deal with it either way. You see greenwashing all the time. It's happening as we speak. The climate movement and the green movement has been essentially co-opted. And I think that it will be dealt with by hook or by crook. They're already talking about sort of weather adaptation. That used to be the thing, conspiracy theories, manipulating the weather. Now they're openly talking about it. UN said in 2017, 2018.
Sulfur in the atmosphere.
Yeah, we'll have to manipulate the weather. The corporate monoliths will do something about it and stop and avert a catastrophe. I do believe they will. How it will pan out for maybe the global south is another matter entirely. How it will pan out for Africa is another matter entirely, but something will be done about it. And my concern is that the movement is being co-opted. So no, I don't think it will be dealt with. It's a very big issue. The biggest issue we face, in my opinion, is the species level way, and we can get onto this later actually, the species level way we structure ourselves.
In what sense?
In the sense of how can I put this without sounding completely off the wall?
Oh no, don't worry, man.
We've always structured ourselves. I personally think that we have a massive problem with hierarchy and how we have evolved as a species and how we structure ourselves as a species. I was reading up on you and I was reading up about To the Moon and what you'd written about this project. I'm doing the book on GameStop, and I was quite interested by some of the things you were saying there about sort of corruption and power and what have you. And we both seem to like Naomi Klein. We both talk about Naomi Klein a lot. We have this issue that we've always structured ourselves where there are a few people in charge and everyone else is below. You can trace it back 10,000 years to the earliest civilizations. That's how we've always done things. It's almost like the symptoms change, whether it be what is now corporatism, capitalism, feudalism, whatever form of society you want to put on it. The symptoms are always different, but the illness is the same, that we allow ourselves to leave a few people in charge while the rest of us have to do what we're told, effectively. And I don't mean that in an anarchist kind of way. I mean, we've never moved past mammal state almost, considering we think we're the most intelligent species in the known universe. We haven't evolved as much as we think we have, and we still live in this kind of how other mammals live, in terms of there's always a leader, always someone in charge, and the rest of us do what we're told. And when you factor in human predispositions like greed and desire and human and basic emotions, never ends well.
No.
And it never has ended well. There's not been one point through history where having power so concentrated has worked out well. Otherwise we wouldn't be here.
That's a good way of putting it, actually. I guess, yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
And so for me,
a way that many people, I think, could agree. Like, you don't have to be left wing to agree with
it's not about politics. It's bigger than politics. It's about fundamentally, it's about how we operate as a species. I mean, I suppose the comparison I'd make is that given we behave and have put ourselves across this planet almost like insects do, in terms of the way we have infested this planet, because we've reached every four corners of this planet. We're everywhere. You could say insects. Some people may consider us a virus. The way
I don't like looking at it like that.
I think it's too harsh.
Because what do you do to a virus? Like, you eradicate it.
Exactly.
I don't like that kind of.
I think that's too harsh. I think maybe insect is a better analogy. The way there are so many of us and so spread out, and also our population concentrations have become so dense. We live on top of each other, and yet we don't organise ourselves in the way insects would do, where they all have a common purpose, all have a common goal, although there is always one queen in charge. The majority of them are all working towards the same thing. We're still in that state of, we look to leaders, we look to be led, which ultimately, when combined with our most basic emotions as sentient creatures, leads to our downfall. It's what's led us to this point across at least 10,000 years of history, has led us to where we're at now, where the climate's screwed, we're facing a catastrophe, and ultimately it's of our own making. Not necessarily all our own making in terms of that. I like the fact and figure that across the past sort of 30 odd years, 75% of greenhouse gas emissions have come from 100 corporations. It's this whole notion of we've all got to do our bits is nonsense. We haven't got to do our bit. It's a small group of people have caused this. We've allowed them to do it. So we have to bear some responsibility for that.
There's definitely a sense in that. I was listening to a great conversation with on Lex Fridman's podcast yesterday, actually, where he'd asked about like if a society is going down a direction that you believe to be wrong, or in a situation that you believe to be wrong, that how much responsibility or action do you think that one individual should take? And the guy, I cannot remember his name, he's a Harvard philosophy professor, and he fucked me off unbelievably because he kept saying Sartre about Jean-Paul Sartre.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and he kept saying Sartre, and I was just like, you're a philosophy professor. You should know how to pronounce the fucking name. And
alarm bells immediately.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, it was brilliant. Like, it was a really fantastic conversation. It was just that thing, the first 30 minutes when they were discussing it, I had to try so hard not to switch it off, because I was like, I'm really enjoying this. But every now and again, he would say like Sartre, and I'm like, man, just like say it right.
And you managed to maintain your concentration, though?
Yes.
Excellent.
Thankfully. But he was basically saying that like we all participate in society. We should take some level of responsibility. Like, what that is difficult to say. But like, what would you say is your thought on or your sense of like, what do we do? Like, what's the remedy in your mind to the concentration of power?
It's a very difficult question, and it's become more difficult. Just to backtrack slightly. I don't, in my head and the way I think, I don't view things in terms of sort of recent history. I do like to try and broaden out thinking across sort of thousands and thousands of years. I don't know what the solution is. Me and my partner Nicola constantly have this debate, because she says, she won't mind me saying this, I'm sure. She says, all you do is moan and don't come with solutions, which is fine. I understand that. I'm really not sure, because the problem is there is an imbalance between our technological progression, in my opinion, between what as a species we are able to harness and what we know and what we understand about the universe and the way we interact with it, and how we have developed in terms of both technology and our intellectual understanding. But again, that is concentrated in the hands of very few people. For the rest of us, I think, are regressing as a species. We are regressing in terms of the fact that since the end of the Second World War, particularly, which I know, again, I've read sort of you speak about that as well, since the end of the Second World War, but specifically as you pinpoint since 1980, really, there's been a seismic shift in the way we live and the way we exist almost. And while as a species as a whole, we seem to be progressing, I think as individuals, we've regressed, and it's an almost intentional regression that's been pushed upon us in terms of that. On its most basic level, we have 24-hour news now and social media. Our brains are on information overload. We are not designed. Technology and our brain capacity have not kept pace with each other, I don't personally think. That's not saying we're stupid. That's saying that we are on information overload. We've got 24/7 news on us all the time. Social media has become the biggest distraction there is to free and deep thought in some respects. And everything's done online, shopping's done online. Naomi Klein again, and Johann Hari actually wrote about it quite well, in terms of that the sense of community that we used to have has been completely lost or bastardized in some respects. We are all becoming more and more consumed by the system, whatever you want to call that, capitalist, corporatist, neoliberalism, whatever. We're becoming more and more consumed by the system. Our time is less. We're all victims of time poverty. Some of us are victims of time poverty and financial poverty, which is a perfect storm. We are thinking less as a whole and doing more. But what we're doing isn't actually of benefit to anyone. And it's this disparity between our overall advances as a collective, but then our individual regression, which I do think is happening, which has created this perfect storm of, well, what is the way out of this situation? I'd love to be a glass half full kind of person, but unfortunately I'm not. I'm somewhat half empty. And I think, have we gone too far? Is the rot too deep that to actually change things, it would take something so seismic that the population as a whole would not be able to cope with that change, that actually we would just collapse? Because we are so used to now, firstly, going back to my point about hierarchy, we're so used to having people lead us and people in charge. And as we were talking about off air, that almost the majority of the population, we were talking about the fact that Laura Koonsberg and Lewis Goodall from the BBC were karaokeing and partying at the Tory party after conference and just doesn't seem ashamed about the fact. And we were saying off air that most people would be like, whatever. And this is not people's fault. I'd like to make it very clear. I'm not being patronising. I'm not dismissing people's intelligence. There's a vast difference between intelligence and intellect, in my opinion. Boris Johnson's an intellectual. He's thick as pig shit. He is. Yeah. He had an decent education, so he knows a lot of things. Doesn't make him intelligent. That's not to say that it's because people aren't intelligent. People's lives are so consumed by living and having to survive now, and being keeping up with social media, doing your online shopping, going out to work to earn enough money, going to your second job to earn enough money to be able to buy a few nice things. Where's the next holiday coming from? What's happening with this? What's happening with that? I need to buy this. I need it. Blah, blah. Our lives are overwhelmed now completely, and that leaves no room for people to be able to actually step back and critically think. And this is how the system and its proponents get away with what they do. We are overwhelmed as a species. Our brains are constantly overwhelmed. And that is only becoming worse. That ain't going to improve. Therefore, by default, I cannot see the collective action that's needed to be able to change things from the bottom up. Change will only continue to come from the top, from the people who do have the time to go, right, well, we need to do this and change this. And you see it all the time. You see it especially on the left. It seems to be... In politics, people think it's the preserve of the right, that somehow there's rich people sort of pulling the strings and they're in charge and blah, blah. It's the same on the left. It's the same whether you were at the Labour Party conference under Keir Starmer, or, to be brutally honest, and this will put the cat amongst the pigeons with a lot of people, whether you were at the counter festival, The World Transformed, which was a counter festival in Brighton, which was kind of the Corbyn left organising and getting together. They've been doing it a few years. It's still people in positions of privilege deciding what is good for the rest of us. I can afford to go to the World Transformed, and I'm a journalist. So therefore, the scenarios and the problems are still the same, and I cannot see how we can get out of that. I think we're too far gone. I think we're going to have to tolerate trotting along, and as, again, Ken Loach summed up to me a couple of weeks ago, taking these bits of progress where we can grab them and making the best of a bad situation. Because to truly change as a species, we all have to be on board with that change. Otherwise, it won't work. You can't have... And it was the problem with the Corbyn movement. There was a lot of talk about... And please interrupt me if I'm going on, by the way, because I will just go on. It was one of the issues with the Corbyn movement. There was a lot of chat at the time about, oh my goodness, Corbyn's going to bring in socialism. Blah, blah. That was the main stick that was used to beat him with by the corporate press and the right of the political spectrum. How he's going to enact socialism and it's going to be a disaster for this country was the negative. The positive was, oh, finally, we've got a socialist leader of the Labour Party who was going to enact progressive egalitarian policies, etc., etc. Both of those statements were false.
Okay, why was the latter false?
Corbyn was a democratic socialist. He wasn't a socialist. No socialist would have fostered a plan which him and John McDonnell did to enact your policies. You'd issue 500 billion worth of gilts to the stock markets. How's that socialist? Okay. Borrow from the stock markets to put in socialist policies. Firstly, that was a big gamble that the stock markets would even accept the gilts in the first place. For what?
You're talking about their plan to use quantitative easing to get
effectively,
to fund a lot of the projects.
Effectively. I personally didn't, even if they got elected, it would be highly unlikely that would happen. But secondly, there's nothing socialist about investing in the system, which is as, again, we will discuss later on, which is the rot around us. So no, he wasn't socialist. He was progressive and a progressive democratic socialist, but he was more along the sort of Nordic model of politics. And so for me, that would have been a change. And how long would it have been a change for anyway? Again, we're talking, everything's always spoken about in what seems like very grand ideas, very big ideas, very long-term ideas. This is our political system. Corbyn would have been in power for 2, maybe 3 governments before there was a switcheroo again, and we went back to a right-wing government. That's just how it works. Yeah. These things are in a constant state of flux.
I wouldn't even describe it as a right-wing government. I like the way I look at it is that it's an establishment government.
Yeah. I mean, that's another edition of this show in itself. The sort of lines of left and right. Yeah, okay, establishment, corporatist government, I suppose is one way to put it. But so to sum up, I think we're too far gone. I cannot see that we can fundamentally change as a species. I think we can continue to tinker around the edges as we are doing and trying our best to improve things. But again, it's like... Again, I keep referring back to this, but it's still fresh in my mind. Ken Loach said to me, we fought for the 8-hour day. Where the hell's that now?
Yeah. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment for us in the comments below. Let me know what you thought and if you'd like to see more of this from the show. Thank you, and we'll see you again next time.